So, welcome. We are again on Over the Mountains, and today I am again with my beloved Rufus Pollock. And today I really want to actually discuss with you what's behind the fact that we have so many tech billionaires. Because we used to have millionaires and they were very wealthy people, but what is very interesting today is that most of the wealth seems to happen with in the tech industry. And how come that is? And I really, therefore, wanted people to hear your thesis behind what's happening. So, yeah, may you answer our questions.
Yeah. So there are two things that you're identifying, both that actually there is a growing inequality and concentration of wealth and power, and that is directly most of those people who are getting extremely wealthy and powerful, like Elon Musk or, even Bill Gates before, or Jeff Bezos, etc. They are associated with the technology industry. And specifically, when we say tech industry, we basically mean the information technology industry, just to be clear. We're not talking about them doing agricultural technology or something like that. We're talking about mostly about digital and information technology. So the simple answer to that is actually very easy. And we can just tell a very simple story that illustrates this, that comes from the Open Revolution book that I wrote in 2018. And imagine that we're all apple farmers to start with. We have an economy or a society of apple farmers like you, Sylvie, me, Rufus. If you're listening, imagine yourself as an apple farmer. And, we imagine even though it's a free market kind of competition between apple farmers, and there's maybe Sylvie's very good at apple farming, and like, so her apple farm grows a bit, and maybe I'm not so good at apple farming. So maybe, I have some problems. But there's kind of just classic free market competition. And in general, in that world, there's going to be some inequality. There's going to be some differences in apple farmers and how wealthy they are. But it's probably quite limited because essentially you have to be able to, if you're labor, you have to be able to tend your apple trees and so on. You have to pick the apples, you have to plant them. Then imagine one day in our village, there arrives a witch. And the witch goes from house to house saying, I've got this magical apple seed, pay me 10 gold coins and I will sell it to you. And everyone's pretty skeptical. But there's one apple farmer called Mr. Gates. And Mr. Gates says, okay, I'll do it. And he pays her the 10 gold coins and he goes out, as she says, and plants the apple seed that night at the full moon. And it grows the next day. Sorry, he comes out and there's this magnificent apple tree. Wow. And it's that's already pretty amazing. But it's like, okay, well, but he goes over the tree and he pulls one of the apples off because there are already apples in the tree. And what's incredible is the apple immediately regrows. Like bam, it's there. And so what he realizes he's got an infinite, like he can just get as many apples as he wants, an infinite apple tree. And you can imagine what happened to the apple farmer economy. Once Mr. Gates has his tree, he can produce unlimited apples. And so basically everyone else will go out of business and Mr. Gates will remain because he can supply the entire apple market of the region. And he won't set his prices at zero. That's what it actually costs him each apple. He'll set a price basically so that he comes to take over the whole market. And as I said, so the rest of us will all go out of business and Mr. Gates will become extremely wealthy. So you can just see this very simple parable that once you have costless reproduction, costless copying, as we call it, you're going to naturally have this inequality arise very rapidly. And in particular, so it's just a really simple story of like what has happened to our economy. Because what's magical and actually amazing about digital technology, I will come to this, is the costless copying. So what maybe we don't even notice because we take it for granted is that in the physical world, the world of atoms, I'm going to compare it to the digital world of bits. The world of atoms, once I have one copy of something, it does not mean I have more. If I have one banana, to make two bananas basically costs me roughly the same as having one banana. If I have one bunch of bananas to grow 1,000 bunch of bananas takes 1,000 as much land, 1,000 as much effort, 1,000 much fertilizer, and so on. Or even for cars, and they're things which have some economies of scale. But essentially, when I've got one car, to make the next car, I still need just as much steel, just as much labor, just as much, welding time and so on. So I cannot click my fingers and say, okay, I've got one car, I want a car for everyone on the planet. Or I've built one house, now I'm going to have a house for everyone on the planet. We can't do that in the world of atoms. Doesn't work that way. But in the world of technology, it does. In the world of digital and bits, it does. Once I have one copy of a computer program at very little cost, effectively, you could say zero cost, I can make a copy of that for everyone in the world. We can have movies. Once there's one copy of a movie on, on a server somewhere, we can give it to everyone. Um, so there's this fundamental change in the physics, in the kind of fundamental nature of the goods that we are producing in our society over the last 50 years. No, to be clear, we've always had information goods of some kind. People told stories around a campfire. There was ideas, if you like, ways of doing things. But they were a really, really minor part economically of our societies, fractions of a percent maybe. And in the last 50 years, they've gone from being this tiny fraction to basically the majority. I think if you look at the statistical data, because it's difficult to track this because we don't really divide things up into what I would call material or atom goods and digital goods, but roughly in somewhere in the 2000s in advanced economies in the world, information goods became the dominant, more than the majority of what we were producing.
Mm.
And so we've moved into this world of the magical, Mr. Gates's magical apple from the world of basically being apple farmers before. And like night follows day, that leads this inequality if you combine it with a social rule. This is the cliche thing. Because costless copying alone is magical. With costless copying alone, we could have apples for everyone in the world for free. We could
Mm.
feed everyone. No one need go hungry. No one need. Everyone can have access to information. We think of Wikipedia and so on. However, in that story, what I didn't mention, obviously, is Mr. Gates has exclusive ownership of his apple tree. We could have imagined that story where the witch comes to the village and maybe the village elders all get together and they decide, oh, we're going to put all our money together and we'll buy the apple seed from the witch and we'll plant the apple seed, the apple tree in the middle of the village and it will be open to everyone. Now, in
Mm.
that world, yes, apple farmers wouldn't be in business anymore, but we'd all have apples. We'd all be kind of as well off, in fact, better off than before. And in
Mm.
fact, inequality would go down because before there were some apple farmers who were really well off and some who weren't, and there were some people who were starving without able to eat apples and so on, and now they had apples and so on. So if we'd had a common ownership of this new technology of the apple tree, we had a very different story. So what I wasn't mentioning is it's combining this just fact of the world, this physical revolution in the nature of what we're producing, combined with exclusive ownership
Mm.
of those things in the form today of what we would call monopoly rights, intellectual property monopoly rights, and that's that's not necessarily the order of things. So we want to come to that, but basically to understand what's going on, and I'll say a little bit more. There's a little bit of additional part of this story, but very simply, this story about apple farming, which I think anyone, a child, can understand, explains why there's been this explosion in wealth inequality, particularly associated with the tech industry. And this is really important to get because most people think about wealth inequality coming from other sources. But if you look, I think of the top 10 Forbes billionaires, I think now eight are from tech.
Mm.
You go down the list, Elon Musk, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison, Bill Gates. It's
Mm.
just tech people. And these are also fortunes acquired in the last 40 or 50 years. Almost all of them since the dawn of the information revolution, which strictly is 100 years ago, the end of the Second World War is the first digital computers. So it's now not quite 80 years, but it was really in the 70s, the early 60s and 70s that tech really took off as an industry. Um, and so, Larry Ellison, I think it's 76, Oracle's founded around the same year as Apple, I think is 78 or 79. You have Uh, um, we Microsoft is founded, I think, 76 or 77, and so on. And this is just what's happened.
You're kind of what you're saying is what drives the inequality is this like what digital tech is allow is this kind of costless copying and that it's run with a monopoly right that
Yes,
is
it's
the
this
combination. So,
combination.
wait, so you're kind of saying that if there was just a costless copying, you wouldn't see as much inequality because, you know, one would just one would just be able to share and use this information freely and but it's the fact that there is a monopoly right on top of it um, that allows people to um, sell at very little cost, yet maintain all the profit for themselves.
Exactly. You down, and this again is so the metaphor, like I like to say, is if you think of fertilizer, right, for ammonium nitrate, which is a fertilizer, it's great, right? It can help your crops grow, but if you combine it with the right other substances, so it's a combination, you can make a bomb that can
Mm,
blow things up. So when you combine costless copying, which is like this incredible, economic fertilizer, but you combine it with monopoly rights. And when it comes to the free market ideology, which you were talking about yesterday, that relates to that, you create this basic inequality bomb.
mm,
You create something that's just going to create unprecedented levels of concentration of wealth and power. I mean, I think what's also really important to emphasize is it's not just about wealth. In the story, Mr. Gates now controls access to basically food. If apples are the food in this society. Similarly, if you're Google, you controlled, at least till very recently, where people got information from. I mean, there's
mm.
a really famous study in a major journal showing with a simple experiment, a real proper experiment, that Google could probably have changed elections depending on what they showed on the first page of their results. They actually showed that if they did manipulate those results, in many close elections, they could shift a couple of percentage points. There's also evidence about Facebook with natural experiments that depending on what you showed people on Facebook and whether you got them to go out to vote, you could probably shift elections. And so this is not just about economic power, though that economic power then, but about social power, about the ability to control access to knowledge, to shape the way people think and behave. I mean, this is now notorious about Facebook, but when I was writing this in the 2000s, 2010s, that wasn't yet the received view, but we now really know that. And so it's just really, really significant. And so, but to go back, it's the combination of costless copying and monopoly rights in the form of intellectual property. Now, and if you didn't have that, if you combined costless copying with some kind of different institutional approach to how we owned and paid for and resourced the innovation that leads to the witch had to maybe do research in her laboratory to come up with the magical apple seed. We need to pay for that, but there are many ways we could come up with that. We just discussed the village could come together and pay for it together. Now, maybe I don't know whether you want to go into that in a moment or just to say there is, for people who are listening, there is a second thing driving the concentration, which is the platform effect. I don't know if you want me to talk about that first or whether we should come to the monopoly rights or the source of that. What would you suggest?
Uh, well, yeah, let's actually, if I'd love to ask you, why are you so passionate about this? How come you're so passionate about this
Great.
before we go on to the like point around
So,
platform?
yeah. So something happened to me as a child. I don't know. I think my parents were people quite interested, very interested somehow in fairness, and at quite a deep level. So my father was a lawyer, my mother was a farmer, and I remember somehow, I just remember, for example, one time I must have been 6 or 7, and I went to school in England and we played cricket. And for some reason, I got to be captain of the cricket team one time. I think I was in the older team and I got to captain of the younger team. And my father, I remember telling me, and I must have been 6, and I still remember this, saying, "Look, you're gonna." my school, it was very competitive and it was all about often winning, even at like 7 years old. And he said, you're going to give everyone a chance to kind of play. And that was this aspect that we should give everyone a chance, in this way. And that really touched me. I also remember a story with my father, which was that at one point when I was about, again, 7 or 8, I figured out that my sister, who was 2 years younger than me, was getting paid more pocket than me, money than me. Like we got this small amount of pocket money, like 10p a week or something like that, 10 pence a week, which is like 10 cents a week or and but I figured out not that she was getting more than me then, but she was getting more than I had got when I was her age, which was pretty impressive as a 7 year old for myself. I was quite proud when I figured this out. And I went to my dad, and my dad said to me, "Listen, son." I think my father hadn't realized this. I think looking back, he just made something up. He was like, "Listen, son, I'm teaching you that life is unfair." And I was just like, "What? You know, that's what are you not, what are you talking about?" Um, and this kind of deep outrage. I remember feeling this really, really kind of almost angry and hurt. Um, and certainly later on, I remember I had the idea at the time, which was that, yeah, life is really unfair. I mean, I have benefited from, like, for example, enormous privilege in my life. I've never had to face a lack of food. I've got to go to being educated really well. I've got all kinds of benefits. And just if I'd been born somewhere differently in the world, that wouldn't have been the case. And and it's I think our duty, I'd actually say our kind of moral duty to try and make the world fairer and more kind and more just. And that was also quite visceral. I think like my experience of school was not great in the sense of like I like learning. I didn't always get on great with other kids, or in fact most of the kids there was just kids who'd bully other kids. I got on okay, but it's just like, wow. I remember friends of mine getting bullied, getting, mercilessly teased. And I just really had this visceral sense we wanted to change that. So that's a long story to say. I was really interested in how we made a better society from when I was like quite young, and certainly
But
when I
how
was a
does that
teenager.
relate to open? How
And
does that relate to
and
economy?
then yeah, yeah. And so
Can I ask more?
I
Because
yeah,
you could have taken so many paths in this desire to make the world more fair, but there's a
yeah,
thing of like your interest about like, oh, wanting to understand those kind of like, I would say, um, underground subterranean patterns
right,
that are driving some of those
right.
unfairness, inequality, and suffering.
Yeah, so that was the source, and then maybe then a long story short was like, okay, I was also interested in like root cause analysis and making the biggest difference in a way. I was kind of like, well, I could go and become a doctor, and I could, right, some other thing. But what made really if you had a really long lever, as Archimedes said, you can move the world. So if you go and change something at the systemic level, the metaphor I think I've often used is epidemiologists save many more lives than primary care doctors. People never make soap operas about them. There are no cool hospital soap operas about epidemiologists doing statistical analysis about cancer, but actually their impact is maybe huge because they see the patterns and they identify what's causing, for example, lung cancer or heart disease or these things, and they change whole, we learn from that. So the answer of why open was just at some degree accident in the sense I was looking for ways to make systemic difference. I actually was systematically analyzing that when I was 21 or 22. Where could you make the biggest difference? A bit effective altruism like. And I kind of stumbled into open in the sense that I stumbled by accident. I was teaching myself programming and various other things at that time. I was in Cambridge, and I kind of met people. And then I thought that that was an issue that was really underserved. Like very few people work on it. Yeah, it was obvious to me immediately that this was the future of our society. We were going to move into a knowledge economy. I mean, people were saying that in the late 90s with the internet, but it was very few people were yet working on it. And there'd been these major pieces of legislation that were getting passed with almost no public scrutiny. And so I was like, okay, there's almost no one here. Let's go and work on this. And it was around the start of like when Wikipedia was coming out. I worked with Creative Commons, and then I started the Open Knowledge Foundation. So that's how I got interested. And it was an example where I thought also there was a real this was the biggest change in the nature of our economy, really maybe in the whole of human history, but certainly since the agricultural revolution, since the moment, for good or ill, that we stopped being hunter-gatherers over a period of time and adopted agriculture. I mean, this was we've never had a change from like atoms to bits of that kind in human history. And it could be so amazing, right? We suddenly had the ability metaphorically to feed the world. We and that was also something I think intoxicating uh, that many people get in tech, and I think it's both wonderful and a little bit dangerous, is this, wow, I can share this with the world. I can go from making something kind of in my basement to everyone on the planet having it tomorrow. Like
Mm,
we can make this podcast and this recording, and we can give it to everybody tomorrow.
yeah. So actually coming to this kind of like uh costless copying and that sense of like the digital tech uh in this actually narrative, I feel there's actually a flaw in it because there's a lot of infrastructure that makes this digital tech possible. I mean, all the cables that runs, all the service that runs,
Yeah.
it feels digital in the sense that it's on your screen and you can barely touch it. But actually, all the matters that needs to exist to kind of like make the computers, the minerals, the electricity that actually takes is like there's that illusion that it's like ethereal, like
Yes.
magic, but it's actually full of matter. And all the like both all the research, but also all the matters to make that possible. Um, but I want to go into that in the sense that um, what you're saying is that there's also like a cost to make that first copy or a first cost to build
Yes.
infrastructure. And then once that is built, so many can like benefit from it. The way like maybe it costs something to dig the well, that then everyone in the village can then go and have access to the water. But I do wanted to point out that there is still a cost in building that well, in digging
Yes.
that hole, and but is that maybe actually often these things are built by the commons, often through government structure, um, you know, but the benefit of the water or the profit of that water is benefiting a very small
Yeah.
population.
Yeah, I mean, you're making several points. So one is just to acknowledge correctly that it isn't exactly costless copying. There is, well, there's two parts. There's the fixed cost of the first copy, which does have a whole bunch of costs and maybe very large costs. And then there's still some cost of the costless copying. When the bits that make up this recording, they have to be stored somewhere. That takes some, servers, it takes some energy, electrical energy to keep them there. And then when they flow out to someone, they go through cables and so on. That is fairly minimal compared to if I wanted to send you a new car. I like
Yes.
so that point.
Can
But
I say why I
let's come
wanted to
back to the
bring
yeah,
that point? Is that I feel that today, in this kind of like tech, digital tech, there's like a going more and more in the mind, going more and more in the less
yes,
embodied and the physical
yes,
matter, and seeing the world in the physical matter. And I'm wanting to make this point so that there's a kind of mindfulness also in when using the tech to realize this is possible through the earth, like it's
yes,
possible through like taking all the metal, and there's a lot, there is an exploitative dimension in creating these infrastructure of like, extracting from the earth to make that. And it's
yes,
maybe not, you don't maybe speak so much to that point, but I think it's quite important to make that point in when we talk about our relationship to tech and the economy, that there's the digital tech economy, but it's still always based on like a physical reality that tends to be
yeah.
underestimated.
Well, the most obvious is our brains. I mean, that the original information technology. technology was our was brains and was language and was sound. You know, when we spoke to each other, we shared information.
Mhm.
And the that was also, by the way, Costas copying to some extent. When I told you a story around the campfire, or I told you where there's a good place to find good game, you know, to go and hunt good game, or where there are good berries to find, or where there's water, I was sharing information relatively costlessly. You know, I was there were sounds, and then they went in your brain, and your brain sort of stored them in some way. And
Yes, there's something very infatuating for human beings about information because I think there's something
yes,
very core to human beings that understand that having some information can really mean survival or flourishing if specifically you had a piece of information that others didn't. Um,
yes, yes, and it uh I mean, in a sense, we are infatuated with knowledge in a certain way, knowledge is a form of basically not knowledge in the form of like concepts in our mind are in one way just embodied cultural informa imitation. You know, like where do I other animals might not have these concepts. They know they learn from others where there was water. What our superpower is, and we're going a little bit it's, of humans, is this cultural imitation, the ability to have culture and to have memetics, to basically shift learning out of the genetic realm, which is quite for good or ill is quite slow. So when we learn, it would take a lot of time to have that learning gradually build up through natural selection. Like, oh, this is a way to
yes,
use my beak
so
to open nuts. Then I
it's
switch
great.
to the mimetic world, to the world of the mind reproducing concepts between humans.
And that we do much faster. And so I think that's also behind the kind of like acceleration that we see in the tech industry because it allows the mimetic to catch like wildfire. The costly
Yes.
copying allows the mimetic to catch like wildfire and to create that massive acceleration um, that we're
Yeah.
witnessing.
And we're going, I mean, one of the books I've still never finished, but I started was called A History in Bits, of which was a history, what a history of bits, basically of information technology, because each technology we've had has exactly accelerated this capacity of cultural learning and sharing. So writing, you know, is one of the classic early information technology breakthroughs, or 5,000 years ago, well, yeah, maybe 3,000, 4,000 years ago in Sumer, in ancient Babylon. You know, we have cuneiform, we have writing, and writing allows us to store information over time and to transmit it over distance, which are both hard with an oral system. So basically, it's classically storage, transmission, and processing are the three aspects of information technologies. Then we have the printing press, 1450 with Gutenberg. We have these moments of things. And it's true that that acceleration of memetics, in a way, and particularly it's the similar with AI, by the way, today. What's kind of unusual is that you had it in biological evolution, but essentially innovations in information technology themselves, basically some of the information technology are themselves, it's kind of recursive. They operate on the information technology system. So you have new ideas, and some of those ideas are how to store, transmit, or process information better. And so this is actually the fear about superintelligence. That is, once you teach essentially, once you can teach AI to program and to modify itself, you're going to have this kind of explosive compounding blow up where the AI can improve itself, which can then improve itself, and you just get this intelligence explosion incredibly fast. Like, you know, it could happen in seconds or days. And you go from something which is like, oh, well, it's pretty powerful, but we kind of feel it's still in our control, to something that's just like, whoa, this is taken over. And so this old aspect going back, this ability that when we had some new idea like cuneiform, you know, we're going to invent writing somehow, that itself allows us to then get better at memetics, at cultural evolution through sharing knowledge. And just to be clear, cultural evolution isn't just conceptual knowledge, it's also behavior and custom and institution, all kinds of things. But yeah, that's a very interesting
Well,
point. And I think the infatuation with it, I think just a really, as someone who has been intoxicated, and still does get intoxicated. And it's very left brain in McGilchrist sense. You can feel this addiction in you. It's like there's a reason that people get addicted to programming software, a bit like you get addicted to playing video games. In that there's this kind of like, oh, I fixed something, I got it to work, and then I can share it. I can send it to others. There's this, there's this and this addiction of learning as well, like the way we, as you say, it's like very deep in our genetic evolution to want to know things and learn things. There's a very deep payoff to that, in a reward system because that was good for our survival. And it's kind of dangerous, right? It's like this thing where it's become it's become so out of control and so taken to an extreme. When we invented writing 4,000 years ago, tempo doesn't pick up very much. Whereas now, I think I'm just going to speak for myself. I feel overwhelmed. If I go, most of the time, I go on social media, or I go on the internet in general. I mean, it's just like the pace. I don't think there's any person or even organization on the planet that has any sense of like, wow, they have a grip on what's going on. It feels, and not in a good way, out of control. It feels like, wow, you've unleashed the genie. And so I think that aspect is quite deep. But we were talking more about the economic
Yeah.
implications
So
and systemic
I
implications.
wanted
We should
to
come back to that.
come back a little bit because we took like a sideway, but just to repeat, you because I thought this point was quite important. You said there was three elements of like the transmitting information, storing it, and
And
what?
processing it.
And
So the ability
processing.
to basically create meta mind, like we create little
Okay,
mini
so just
processing.
is like because I want to make sure we stay on track. So
Yeah.
transmitting, processing, and storing was the three. And kind of coming back to the inequality that has arisen due to the digital tech and the monopoly. Um, because what we're interested here in this kind of over the mountain is that okay, there's some like there's a difficulty of climbing over this mountain in the sense that there are a lot of problems and things that are not working as well as we'd like. But also there's to get to the other side in a world that would work for everyone in that
Yes, to
second
get to the,
renaissance,
how
in
do
the
we get to
sort
a
of
new paradigm?
meta-modern dream and reality that is possible. But to get to there, there's things to kind of overcome. And one thing to overcome is the fruits of this kind of digital inequality that the economy, the inequality that the digital industry run on monopoly has created. And so I want to explore a little bit that more because so because that's an important dimension that our economy influence massively our society and how we organize ourselves. So before we go into um, yeah, so to come back to that, so one dimension has been this kind of like the costless copying, the monopoly right that amplify this effect. But another thing that is an amplifier is also the platform effect. So
Yeah.
could you speak a little bit to how the platform effects also amplifies this and plays as a additional layer to it?
Right.
And
Because there's a
maybe
tech.
explain to people what is a platform effect,
Yes,
because some
I'll
people
do
might
that.
not
So,
know.
so first of all, yes, there's a second feature that compounds this inequality coming from costless copying plus monopoly rights or exclusive ownership. And so platforms, uh, we now that name has now come into common discourse, so people will be more familiar. But essentially, when a platform refers that there's some maybe institution or some technology that sits in between two groups, um, normally. So there would be consumers and producers, and then there's a platform in between. So there's also cases where there's just one group, but they still need a platform. So the classic example are networks, the basic platform, which is well, let me pick a yeah, well, one would be telephone networks. In a telephone network, you don't really care about the telephone, your mobile phone provider. What you care about is being connected to other people on that platform. You want to be able to call other people. And so classically, there was this aspect you need to connect to the network provider, the platform of the mobile phone or the telephone company, and then you could call all the other people that you wanted. That's the original basic platform. In that, there's just one group, but they go through this platform to connect to each other. The other examples are your software, your operating system on your computer, which again, if you if you've got a mobile phone, you could think you don't maybe even notice it on a Android phone, it would be called Android. That's the operating system. On an Apple phone, it's you've got iOS, you've got this operating system. And you don't maybe notice it, but you care about applications on your phone. You want to use some application on it, or whatever it is. Um,
Everybody is compatible with everyone, what everyone
Right,
else.
but that application has to work on the operating system, and then you get the operating system which the applications run on. The other classic examples that you have are maybe like the things like Google. Google is this immense platform where you are a user, you come to the platform wanting to get information or find information. And on the other side of that is all the content providers. So you know, in a way, care about Google. You want to just get the content you want as a
Yes.
user. But you need an intermediary, some platform in between that
Yeah.
organized it for you.
What they're hard is that once it's very hard to switch. Like
Right.
if you're dissatisfied with a platform, like so for example, currently, in the music industry, there's Spotify and it's like a massive platform. And there's a lot of artists who'd like to get away from Spotify, both because one is that they feel that Spotify doesn't pay them enough, but two is Spotify recently invested in a weaponry that they don't feel ethically represents them, but the consumer might not be following, and there's not a lot of
Right.
alternative. So there's like those switches are really hard. And how can you explain
Right.
that? How does that combine with the digital economy, the point that you made earlier? How
Right.
does that interplace?
So let's exactly. So I don't know if you want to explain, but basically the issue is platforms have this coordination. Once you're on them, there's a big coordination problem. If a seller, like I'm a musician wanting to sell my work through Spotify, I want to go to some other platform. There's no users there. And if I'm a user who wants to go to another platform, there's no artist there. So there's this big coordination problem once you're on a given platform to switch to another, which gives platforms a huge amount of power. Once everyone's going to Google, I can build another search engine, but no one comes there. And if I don't go there, then I can't index any content and so on. So just to say, this idea is actually really old. It's a marketplace. Actually, I prefer to call this marketplaces. We're all familiar with marketplaces in towns, at least in the old days, before there was Amazon. And you'd go there, and there would be sellers with their stalls, and there'd be buyers who'd come. And obviously, this is really old. This economic feature is really old. And that marketplaces are sticky. If I try to create a new fish market somewhere else in my city and there's already a fish market here, it's going to be difficult because all the sellers are there and all the buyers are there. And why should they move at the same time? What happens is while that is old, it wasn't that ubiquitous. Platforms weren't, they were important, but in the information world, platforms are everywhere, right? And mainly this is
You can
because
take a bigger market and a bigger, like in the
exactly this,
physical world, you could run your little platform that is limited to a region, to a geographical region, you know.
right.
And actually, in the digital economy, like you already see that even in the digital world, like, oh, you see McDonald's everywhere because what they're selling is not just the product, is the brand, which is a information, is a digital like and you see that also with the fashion expansion of brands that can reach, crowds, but in the digital economy, it's just like the platform the platform economy reaches levels, scales that could never be
Planetary scale. Airbnb is everywhere. I mean, Airbnb is the classic platform, right? Once you're on it, everyone goes to Airbnb. So you got to put your property on it. That's where if I'm a user, I go, there's all the properties. Exactly. So one point in kind of planetary scale. Where in the physical world, you've got this limit of marketplaces, which is a distance effect. There might be only one marketplace in my local town, but probably if I go to a town 50 kilometers away, there's another marketplace. But in the digital world, the marketplace is the world,
Costlessly copying allows it to have a planetary thing. And
planetary
like
scale,
what I found sad is also that it
homogenizes.
is so acceptees it like there's no differences, there's no different taste, there's no um uh it becomes everywhere the same. And typically, a little bit like when you
Yes.
go on Airbnb, every Airbnb feels and looks pretty much the same. Like you don't have that
Yes.
like sense of local experience of like something different that you have to adapt to that might make you a bit uncomfortable, but also discovering people. Um,
Yeah, you
and
get this
similar,
IKEA asceticism of every Airbnb.
yes,
Yeah.
it's like IKEA is everywhere in the world. Is like has the platform, those brand being able to operate um on the global scales has also create this kind of like what I feel people experience in this what like this uh capitalism, but also aseptic, aesthetic, like everything is the same.
Yeah.
But so the
I,
digital, so I'm kind of maybe taking us a little bit of a tangent here, but the point you're now making, so that's the third point. First point is costless copying. Two is like there is a monopoly. Three,
exclusive
there's a
rights.
platform and economy that amplify the it allows platform to reach a planetary level, which then reinforce more the monopoly, like those
Yes.
monopoly
Well,
has
let me just summarize it for platforms. So platforms, there's basically the law of the one or the few. If you have an area which is basically platform-like, you end up with only one platform or a very few number because of this tendency of feedback effects between buyers and sellers. Buyers want more sellers, sellers want more buyers, so you end up on the one biggest platform and the others die out.
yes,
Now, again, that platform can be monopolized or open. So we have some examples of open platforms in our history. The most famous one of all, which we are using right now, is the internet. So the internet was built on open protocols. Open, it wasn't owned like most telephone systems were owned. It was open. Anyone could connect to the internet for free. The way that you connect to the internet was free, and it was run in a commons basis. There was ways of coordinating together to run the internet and have this platform where you could send messages to anyone through the internet. And it was the source of the greatest innovation in human history because it was open. Like, funny enough, many of the tech billionaires exist because of the internet being open. So there was Bezos on Amazon, there was Google. The old system, by the way, just so you understand, because we can't really imagine it, would have been there'd been like a monopoly platform that controlled the internet. That was how it was before. There was telcos who controlled it. There was Minitel in France in the 80s. And you would have, if you were Jeff Bezos, you would have needed to go to that platform owner who would have controlled whether you got on it or not and got permission. Now we can imagine that world because that is the world of Facebook. If you want to build an app on Facebook or on WhatsApp, you need permission from Facebook essentially to build
mm,
it. And if it can threatens what they're doing, they will shut you down.
mm,
Yeah. There's a reason they bought WhatsApp because WhatsApp was a threat to Facebook, right? They bought it and they neutralized it. WhatsApp
mm,
has never become, it's kind of a competitor, but it's owned by them. My point is, I'm saying is that basically we have had an example of an open platform. And so platforms as well can be open or closed. They can be open in the sense that who runs them, anyone can participate, and what the system that runs them can be openly owned in the commons. It can be open source. And that
mm.
happened with the internet. Or it can be like Facebook, where it's controlled by a monopolist. Now,
So can
the
you
point
give
I'm
me an
saying,
example concretely about, because I think I understand what you're saying, and I was like, oh, okay,
yeah,
yes. And so it's like there's internet is open, and on top of that, there's something that became a monopoly and not open that runs on top of it, and we don't
yes,
really interact with the internet, although that's the ground in which all these things had flourished
run.
from. But can you give me an example of like, let's say if Spotify was open, how would it work?
Well, let me give also an example that's really relevant to your life that you've told me about, which is that you were really popular on MySpace. You said when you first started out, you were a teenage, you were a performance artist and you were singing and doing other stuff, and you got a big following on MySpace. And you told me that one day MySpace just shut your page down.
Yes. With no
Yeah.
warning, just like shut it down because they felt that my content was too provocative because it had nudity from my performance art. And
Okay.
it was
Yeah.
heart crushing because I lost everything.
Yeah. And that can happen to you on Facebook.
Yes, and
That
on Instagram. It
can
has
happen to
held
you
me
on
back
and-
from publishing my work because I'm like, wow, my work has nudity, it can be misinterpreted. I have my burlesque friends who are like getting constantly on the brink of having their Instagram page close.
right.
Um,
Now, the thing I'm trying to say is you can put stuff on the internet. You never need that. You can create a website and no one will take it down without going through the laws of your country. Now, there are things we might want it as the laws of our country to say, like you're not going to put on, child pornography. Yeah, we all agree on that. But there'd be laws in your country. There'd be a democratic process, and you could appeal, and there'd be a system. Whereas actually on Facebook or MySpace, the platform, the monopolist controlled what you did.
so you're
So I'm just
saying
trying
it's
to
like
say,
instead of
so
being
on
a
the
people
web, you can publish your website, and you don't need permission from some central authority other than complying with the laws of your country to do it.
Yes, and so when you're saying it's like applying with the laws of the country, at least instead of being held by some shareholders and like one guy who has the majority shareholder of a company
Yeah,
who then decides, is at least a civil process where you can debate, you have you can have an appeal, you can pass a law that it
yeah.
allows more civic action. And it's true that we see that there's in our society a kind of disbelief in civic action because also maybe those platforms don't allow civic action to happen, to have what our desire happen. So maybe in the platform today, if the Spotify was open, uh, like the musician would have a say about the
How
the
it ran.
how it ran. Yes, that Spotify
Yes,
wouldn't be allowed to invest in like weaponry because it would be
right.
not just they would put the music, but the platform in itself, they'd have a say in how it would be run.
Right, and they could have a say and say like, well, maybe you want to give more money to up and coming artists than the superstars. We might want to have a more, maybe it's not fully shared, but a more egalitarian distribution structure or ways that we would like the platform to innovate. And this brings me to something really important that's true of both the Costless copy and here. Now, one of the things we focus on inequality because inequality is visible and visceral to us and so outrageous and so outrageously even dangerous to our society in a way. Like the fact that Elon Musk controls Twitter and whether I agree or not with Elon Musk, he can have such impact on our society and on elections. Seems just outrageous to us, right? That one person can do this. But the other aspect is what I call the children never born issue around innovation. So the issue that you're also getting at is that one thing that MySpace could do is shut you down. So there's an impact on free expression and democratic expression. There's the other though is on innovation, and this is more subtle, which is if I control a platform, um, I don't want to let people build on my platform to do things that will endanger me,
Mm.
right?
I
But
think you have
most
a story
innovation,
about how that has happened in a different industry on
right?
the.
So the most famous example was actually the internet, which AT in the US, AT&T was a monopolist at the time, and they were a private company, and they controlled the telephone system in the US. And they basically didn't want the internet to happen. I mean, maybe they didn't even know what it would be, but they consistently tried to stop people building on top of the phone system. Because, right, to run the internet, you do need copper wires at the beginning, right? You don't have fiber. You need actual physical infrastructure to send the signals over. And AT&T liked to have a rule that no one was allowed to connect anything to their platform, to their network of wires, without their permission and approval. And they actually sue people. There was a famous series of cases originally about something called the Hushaphone. So the Hushaphone was this device you could put on your phone that would basically allow you to talk privately. It's a bit of a weird device, right? I think invented in the 50s or late 40s. And AT&T sued its inventor saying, you're not allowed to plug this into the phone system. That AT&T actually had a rule that every phone that plugged into the wall in the US had to be approved by AT&T. The manufacturers of the phones had to get permission and approval from AT&T essentially, because it was a foreign device. And their argument was it could compromise the integrity of the phone system. People could plug something in that would damage the phone system or whatever, and they need to approve it. But it really gave them immense control over what happened. And there was this long-running case about the Hushaphone,
Mm.
right? It took like 7 years, and the inventor, I think, nearly went bankrupt. I mean, but he won. I think in a case in about 1962, I'm trying to get the dates right, but he won this landmark decision. Uh, and that was crucial for the internet because when you run the internet, what you're doing is connecting devices on the wall to your socket originally, and then sending signals over the phone wire. And
Mm-mm.
probably without that, the AT&T would have said no. So we have one really famous example which it happened, but we have famous other examples. I mean, the obvious one is like look at WhatsApp.
Mm.
I mean, WhatsApp was bought not to be shut down, but to be neutralized. WhatsApp was going to become the alternative to Facebook, right? It was
Mm-mm.
the one thing getting traction at a scale that really threatened Facebook at the time. I mean, why did Facebook spend $20 billion on a company that was at the time making, I think, if at best, a few tens of millions of dollars? They paid $24 billion for it.
Mm.
And this is the Kronos, what I call the Kronos effect, which is if Kronos was the father, the head of the Titans and the father, not father, of
Yes, the
Zeus,
father of Zeus and
and he had got told a prophecy that his children would overthrow him. So what did he do? Every time his wife got pregnant, he would eat the child. They would be born and he'd eat them. And one day, I can't remember, like he fell asleep or something, his wife drugged him or something, and the child was born and escaped, right?
she took Zeus away and replaced him with a stone, and so he ate a stone, and she raised him in a secret island. I think it was Cyprus.
Yes, exactly. You know, exactly. And then Zeus does escape and he does overthrow the Titans and his father.
Mm.
And this is the fear of every monopolist. It's what they sit awake at night, Google, Sergey Brin, like, worrying about that someone will come and take away their monopoly because that's what's happened every time. IBM was once the biggest, the most powerful company almost in America.
Yes, my father
Who
used to
uses
work for.
IBM today? Yeah, your father used to work for IBM. IBM today still exists, but it's nothing big. Think of
Mm.
Windows was once a massive deal. I mean, it still lives on in some way, and it's getting. But the thing is, most monopolists live in fear of being eaten by their children, and so what? Why the most destructive effect actually of of exclusive control in this information world is that people who have platforms or just control of some area of a market can stop innovation coming that would endanger them, and that is a lot of innovation that would be built on top of them. And so you look at the ecosystem on top of Facebook and you look at the ecosystem we got from the internet, and it's incomparable. What we got from the internet in terms of innovation and in terms of new companies has changed our whole world.
And like
But
you
what
made
we have on
a
top
very
of Facebook is
interesting point
Farmville. We have
about
Farmville.
yes, what you like made a when you shared about like you know, AT&T not wanting others to be able to like plug their thing on top.
Yeah.
Like suddenly I had this like I was like, "Oh, that's what Apple does. Is like it runs closed. It does not want anyone to be able to plug in." It's also what probably Elon Musk is doing with sending all those satellite that is owned by Musk. Is like so that you know only he controls it.
It's
And
like SpaceX. SpaceX at the moment, it's not, it will change, but it's one of the only ways to get your satellites into orbit. And so guess who they'll favor? Are they going to favor their satellites, launching their satellites, or Blue Origins? Exactly. When you control a choke point in an economy, when you control a platform, a place that people have to go through to get to consumers, you have immense power. And that power is always when it's abused. Unfortunately, it's always abused when it is controlled. It's either abused for economic gain or for social control. Uh,
it could be abused by governments.
it can. So what you don't, there's two parts. It can be abused by anyone, but if you need some governance structure. And if that governance structure is democratic,
There's
then
more safeguard, you're saying.
you have safeguards, or by a community, by a group or a community. I mean, the question here is of governance. It's like the question is when you have exclusive control oriented to profit versus controlled by a community, whether that's through a government, which is ultimately the state like is elected in democratic societies, or it could be for example, Spotify could be run by a cooperative of users and artists. Artists and users could get together and say, we're going to form a council. There'll be a council. It will be elected in some way by the artists and by some representatives of the users, and it will govern Spotify to create an amazing platform for artists and consumers who to interact and be and to create art. You could
Well,
have
now I'll have a different question, but I think we'll open it for another time because we're going to wrap up, which is like, but why cooperative so ineffective in the sense like so slow at establishing themselves and running? Like when I hear cooperative, I'm like, oh,
oh
really
no, yeah,
ineffective, slow, and etc. And like I think it's an interesting question to have because like the dream you're selling sounds amazing, but I'm like, I've seen many cooperative. They don't seem the most like savvy,
yeah.
effective forms of governance. They sound for me like often I associate that with dysfunctional. And maybe that's what makes them not competitive and hence, those kind of like um, uh, uh, tech authority. Anyway, but I
Well,
think we should park this question.
you should part that question. I think it's something that people should reflect on. So one is in the open revolution, there's a different model that doesn't require us having cooperatives, which is called remuneration rights, which we might come to in the next episode. Because the question would be left with, okay, what do we do about this? What do we
Yeah.
do about platforms? How do we have open platforms like the internet? How do we have the apple tree, but it's owned by the community in some way more, but yet we still are able to innovate and pay innovators and have kind of free market enterprise or free enterprise, which is a good thing in many ways. Just to say, do be aware that in countries like the Nordics and countries like Germany, and like Germany is the source of most amazing car companies, at least until recently in the world, you have enterprises that have they have representative investors and shareholders, and they have representatives of the workers in the form of unions, and they even have representatives of the community. So, for example, I think it's BMW, but I think it's in Bavaria, you have on the board of those companies like representatives of the local state, representatives of a set of shareholders, and representatives of the workers. And those are
Mm.
pretty amazing companies that are pretty dynamic, have been very successful. That's true in Scandinavia, that you have these mixed stakeholder governance. So it doesn't mean that everyone's voting on what happens on Spotify, but you can imagine having representatives in that world rather than having it run by
This
what
is so
essentially
good. I think we really people need to know that there's alternative government system that has worked in the past, are working, and are possible. Because I think one thing that also creates this like race forward of like only one way of doing it is that we don't know of other success stories.
right. So this is where we want to like maybe it's important to land this episode here in relation to the previous episode for a moment to say, okay, so what's the connection? And so we call this episode Over the Mountains because both we're trying to get how would we actually get to a new paradigm, practically, and the need for collective action. The fact there isn't some shortcut by some other route. Now, just to say here, let's just follow the trace. So one is we're
Maybe we
crucially
slow down. It's okay that we take our time and they will
okay.
just have to
That's good.
listen.
That's good to slow it down. So one is to say that what was crucial in our story about both monopoly platforms and the monopolies that come out of costless copying with Mr. Gates's Apple Tree, well, is exclusive ownership and control through the form of monopoly rights. Now, this is the transportation of exclusive property rights in the physical world into the digital world. Now that transplantation is in itself weird because atoms are atoms, and atoms by their nature are exclusively owned as a physical fact. Only one person can wear a pair of shoes at the same time. Like I can't have two people wearing a pair of shoes. We can't both drive one car to two different places at the same time. But we can do that in the digital world. So there's just there's a naturalness of exclusive ownership to some extent in the physical world. Now, that doesn't need to turn into physical property rights, as many people will be shouting out on this episode. Like there are many societies, many indigenous societies that have very little exclusive ownership of physical property. But there is a fact that even in those societies, my bow that I go hunting with might be my bow. There's my
Only
axe
one person can use it at a time.
at a time, and that might translate into some say over who uses that axe at a given moment. But I'm just saying there's this naturalness of a certain way of physical property, of exclusive ownership of that. But that's weird to translate it into the digital world, right? But even so, you can see the ideological aspect. We are very aware now that even in our societies, many things are not everything is property. We don't and we don't think certain things should be for sale. At least many of us don't think that everyone should be able to sell their organs, or even in many countries still prostitution is illegal because whether we agree with that or not. What I'm trying to say is that
Wait, just slow down to that because I'm like, does that imply that with if you went really full on for free market economy ideology, like then you should be able
everything
to sell your organ?
everything's for sale. Everything's for sale. You should be able to sell your children into slavery. Why not?
Hmm. I
You should
think this is
or
a
you should
very
be able to sell
profound.
yourself into slavery. You should be able to say, "Hey, I'm willing to become an indentured slave for 10 years in exchange for this pay." Societies have done that in the past. Indentured servitude was common, where people could sell themselves or their children into basically servitude for periods of time. And I'm just saying, what I'm saying is the connection is this aspect of combining costless copying with monopoly rights in the form of intellectual property is very connected to the free market ideology that we were talking about yesterday, and this invisible ideology that's shaping our world. And even if it makes actually no sense, this is what I'm also trying to get at today. Once you see that the digital world is fundamentally different at a very fundamental level from the world of atoms, the world of bits and atoms are different. Why on earth would you be applying the same set of institutional rules and like kind of rules of the game that over here to here? Now, one way you would do it is where you don't think that these were rules that were created for the game. If you don't think that the rules that were created for the physical world, like property rights, are actually rules of the game, but they're natural aspects of the universe, that of course there's always private property. Of course, we always do things via markets. That's just
So
the way
just
things are.
slow down. Because I'm thinking of translating what you're saying, because like I think it's what you're saying is that behind those rules that we have of costless, like of running monopoly rights on costless copying, is related to our free market ideology of also ideology of property ideology of like you can have uh uh like that people should have ownership of things that they can sell things and that ideology one is saying like well if you actually ran that ideology fully like you need to really question its ethic and moral standpoint because you should be able to sell organs you can be sell children and we see that there's a flaws in that in our core human respect of life we wouldn't do that if in tune with life and that ideology is like being transposed into our digital economy of like that that ideology of property and also that ideology of property might make sense a little bit in the physical realm but really actually don't make so much sense at all in the digital realm.
Exactly. So just as we would say, hey, we don't want to apply property rights to children and sell them in markets and sell myself into servitude, why would I do this with digital stuff just because I've done it with atoms, right?
Got it.
We what I'm saying is this free market kind of market fundamentalist ideology, and this which goes with like kind of property rights should be everywhere. We should own everything exclusively in this way. Is quite weird in other areas. Like, and to see it as the invention that it is, to say, okay, property rights aren't when we have them, they're an institution that we created. They're not something given by the universe. There is the
Mm,
physical fact of exclusive use of my shoes at a given time, but that doesn't have to translate into a set of rules and cultural norms and institutions that give me like exclusive ownership of them, right?
mm,
Just as the
got
fact
it. And so you're also touching to maybe certain indigenous culture that even in like the physical realm might not have, that similar like rules of exclusive ownership of items,
Right,
the way that the Western world, the capitalist Western world operates under. That there's
right.
many, we can be very creative in ways that we operate in relationship to ownership.
Yes.
And yet you also have to address the fact of the reality of the material world, which is, you know,
It
only
costs
one
out to do
person can
things.
use the
Yeah.
the axe at a time.
Right. What I'm trying to say is though, we might say, okay, that works in the physical world. Like, property rights are probably quite a good idea in quite a few areas,
Yes.
um, and and to see them as the invention, and therefore when we come to a new area, we don't. If you think they're just like laws of the universe, well, of course you apply in the new area. It's why people adopted the term intellectual property. It's a form of ideological propaganda, by the way, quite explicitly adopted and pushed by the industries that want to own content and own information to make it look like normal property. That's why I prefer the term monopoly rights, because basically copyright is a monopoly right. And you can tell that intellectual property is different, by the way, from normal property because it expires. So patents traditionally ended after 14 years or today 20 years. So after 20 years, if there's some new invention for like a drug, after 20 years, anyone can use that invention without having to pay anyone anything. So the fact they're time limited is that they're not like property, and property goes on unless it's a lease forever or for a very long time. What I'm just trying to say is though that this is very much Roberto Unger, not necessarily inspired, but I really want to echo Roberto Unger, this great political thinker, which is he says that we have this kind of poverty of our institutional imagination. We've taken a kind of set of ways of organizing society, like having property rights, like in the way that we do, that are actually quite a recent invention in even in the Western world of like last few hundred years. Um, and we then say this is the only way things can be. I mean, even in property, just to be clear, like you can have exclusive property, you can have leases, you can have property that you can use for certain purposes in certain ways for certain times. There's many ways to even can ha have rights over physical property, right? We can have commons agreements, we can have many forms of institutional innovation that we have. But particularly in this new digital world, there's loads of ways that we could innovate.
Yes, and what I like is like if you make by making that visible is like we are in this ideology, we are a bit brainwashed to think that that's the only way, and so we can't even think that there's possibly other ways because we're so sold that that's the only way and that's good. That and I actually have we all there's really this crisis of sensing how capitalism has is like a cancer, and the capitalism is on top or enmeshed with this free market ideology
Yes,
and in this also ideology of a certain ideology of property. And so in order to invent a new future of a second renaissance, we need to first understand how deeply we swim within a certain ideological frame.
exactly. And
And I
what
think this is a good point to wrap up, by the way. And we can have another episode where we can like dig a little bit deeper into like what that implies and how also certain parties are um, intentionally holding this frame very tightly and this narrative very tightly and don't want to see, uh,
yeah,
it's like they're Kronos. They don't want to see Zeus being born.
they don't want to see Zeus being born. And maybe if there's just one thing to reflect on that people could think at the end is to say, well, one thing to notice about the information age, and let's just pick AI, which is so massive today. All of the people, like Geoffrey Hinton, who got the Nobel Prize for things with AI, who was at like Google, was also there, working for Google as well as his staff. Where do they do all their research? Universities. Where's almost every piece of technology that is even like really recent technology that kind of underpins the AI revolution? It originated in institutions funded by us, by the people, through the state, through governments, where our tax monies went, and they funded research in universities. And did those researchers do things simply because they were paid for the rewards? No, they needed to have a living, they needed to make money. But most researchers are motivated by completely other qualities than than money of their work. And so almost all of the things that underpin the AI revolution, almost everything that underpins the information age, came out of government-funded research. By,
Hmm.
by that, us, you and I, listening to this call, we funded the information age. Our parents funded the information age. And then
Hmm.
we give it over to the techno oligarchs.
Hmm. Amazing. That's a great way to finish this conversation. And you just listen to Over the Mountain, and follow us for a next episode where we'll dig deeper into the path to a second renaissance, a metamodern dream that we get to live in, and the practical and the difficulty and the practical dimension in climbing that mountain.
Thank you so much.
Bye.